Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Sensations English webinar for teachers. Please let me know if you have any problems during the webinar in the chat, and which I will be monitoring. I'm here flying solo today, but I'd like to welcome you and say good day to you wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us today for this talk. My name's Adam. I'm the ELT Education Director at Sensations English, and I'm delighted to be with you today talking on the topic of exploring learner voices, teacher emotions, authentic materials in ELT critical incidents. Just a reminder that if you're watching this webinar live, a CPD certificate will be sent to your email 24 hours after the webinar. And if you're watching the recording, please make your own note of your professional development activity. Just to give you a little bit of information about Sensations English, we are focused on helping teachers with professional development, and we're delighted to be hosting these regular webinars for teachers to support quality evidence-based practice. You can view all our previous webinars on the Sensations English webinars website, including our monthly webinars and our special series on using video in ELT and using authentic materials in English language teaching as well. So please go and check those out if you haven't seen them, and they come complete with the slides from these sessions as well. We hope that they expand your own practice and develop your use of authentic materials with your classes. Sensations English lesson resources are a great new advance in ELT content. We're delighted to offer teachers hundreds of videos and news article resources, all graded at 5 CEFR levels. They make using the news and video and audio content hassle-free for teachers, and with all the digital activities which are prepared for you with them, it means that there's a lot less planning time that's usually associated with authentic materials, and you can focus on the specific needs and interests of your learners and use your planning time for that. Our Sensations English Schools edition is perfect for use in a school environment where all teachers and students get their own logins. There are lesson plans and teacher guides to support your use of the materials, and a digital teacher gradebook where you can organize classes, set and monitor tasks, and create reports on learners' progress to see what's happening with learners' development over time. You can get that by going to the web page, which is at the bottom of the screen, sensationsenglish.com/schools and colleges. But now, to focus back on today's session, just so you know a little bit about me, I have got extensive teaching and teacher training experience, as well as extensive materials writing and editing experience. My wide-ranging interests include teacher development, language development, identity and inclusion, classroom research, inclusive phonology, and global issues. I'm passionate about developing inclusive, high-quality, evidence-based approaches and learning materials. And I'm also joint coordinator of ITEFL's PRONSIG and the education director here at Sensations English. So let's get on with today. So just as a little outline of what we're going to be doing today, we're going to review a few premises around these ideas of learner voices, teacher emotions, and authentic materials, and critical incidents. We're going to look at the challenges that can come up when focusing on these issues or these areas of pedagogy, and then thinking about how can we help our students and ourselves. But first, I'd like you to share an idea about teaching. Could you explain how you currently think and feel about your role as a teacher, using a metaphor? And the image that's here is of a swan with the baby cygnets around them, and that could be one of the metaphors that people use when we ask this question, that they feel like a swan looking after their chicks, or a parent looking after their children, or something like that. So whatever the metaphor is that connects with you at the moment, and can you write your idea in the chat box, and we'll see what ideas come out here. So for example, one of the metaphors that I use is I feel like I'm creating a bridge between different islands when I'm working in class with students. That all the different students are like like islands, and then my job as a teacher is to create bridges between those islands, maybe between the content and those islands as well. Nazlia says the picture illustrates it the best. Okay, so you think that exact idea as well. That's great. And I have met teachers who feel that way as well. But has anyone got any other ideas? And there are so many. Metaphor is such a rich tool for exploring our ideas as teachers. Emila says, we do build bridges. Elmira, sorry, misread that. Yeah, we absolutely do. Other people talk about being farmers, nurturing like flowers and things like that. Nazila's just said build and fix. So they're kind of like, yeah, you're feeling like you're a builder or you're a repair person or something maybe. The construction worker we are. Okay, so that's that. Thank you, Nazila, because that's telling yourself how you feel about your job as a teacher at the moment and your role, and where that puts then the content of the lesson. Maybe it's like your materials for construction, and where the students fit into that. Are they going to be the people who inhabit that building? Are they going to live there or work there? Or is it the building which is then going to serve them in their lives? So all of these different things. Jessica's saying a teacher is a juggler. Yeah, that's a really nice one as well, Jessica. She says keeping their eye on all of their balls at once while also knowing their limitations. Okay, that's an excellent perspective to have on teaching as well. And there's no wrong perspective. Wherever you are as a teacher in your practice is a really important thing to know and think about for yourself, so that you know where you are and the personal context which you bring to the classroom as well. So thank you very much for those. Now, going to talk a little bit about some of these topics. Do you think, having a look at these topics that are on the in this word cloud here, do you think that do you bring many or any of these topics into your classes? Would you find it easy to bring these into your classes? Would you find it difficult? Would you think, no, I definitely can't do that? Because these are all topics in the world around us. These are all issues, whether it's depression or weight or homelessness or stereotypes or politics. All of these things, or same-sex partners or animal rights or death, these are all things that are in the world around us in any language. And they're all topics which we can learn a lot from, because as people, we are connected to other people who experience these things, or we've got some personal connection to them, or we've got some thoughts about them in a political or a social context. And they are things that we would talk about in our own language, potentially, and therefore they're things which we have ideas about and can be a great focus and a tool for development, meaningful language development in a second language. And different opinions in the chat here, and this is exactly why we're here. I try to bring some in. They're very debatable topics. It depends on the student's age. I try to stay away from these. they're not safe enough to be brought up where I live. And there is all of these different considerations to bring to these ideas. But whatever the considerations, it's important to know that they're really useful for developing language in a second language context. There was an attempt years ago to do this called Taboos and Issues, which all of these words in this word cloud come from that resource book, which was not very good because it went directly to these issues with no context, with no introduction. It's like today, the first unit, today we are talking about death. You know, if you have a student in your class who's recently lost somebody important to them, if you have people who have had a series of deaths in their life at some point, you know, there could be a lot of trauma there. There could be a lot of reasons not to bring that topic into the classroom. And this book, sadly, because of the way it was made, with the best of intentions, really used a sledgehammer to kind of approach these topics. And that's, I would argue, not a useful way to bring them into the class because of the anxiety and the stress and the personal challenges that it could bring up for people. So that's just an example here of the different topics, but also how there is a right and a wrong way, or a better or a worse way to bring these topics into classes. And we're going to look at how these topics influence our classes. So, because one of the things that we need to do as teachers, especially in the modern world in which we live, is to develop learners, help learners to develop their voices. And we've got some conflicts there, though, in our role as teachers, because the classroom environment is something and somewhere that we want to be safe. That's one of the primary things that we have to establish in our learning context, is a safe environment for learners to develop in. And issue-based content, unfortunately, presents challenges to that idea of safeness or safety because of the way in which those topics can make students feel or raise issues which are raise questions or opinions which are potentially problematic for that safe environment. And so as a result of that, quite often teachers avoid the challenges to keep the classroom environment safe. And they may do that for, and we, in fact, may do that for a variety of reasons, whether it's our own personal safety in our employment, the concern for a particular student or a particular location where we're working, or it could be something to do with the connection that we have to those issues ourselves. So a quick review of some premises now about why authentic materials, learner voices, teacher emotions, and critical incidents are good for us as teachers and good as part of our teaching environment or our teaching focus. So first of all, the use of authentic materials. They're really powerful in the classroom learning environment as a language tool, because authentic materials increase engagement and interest. They're things about which we as learners already know something about, already have some interest in or some perspective on. And they connect with learners' own experience, whether it's something that as a learner we identify with, or we know about, or we have experienced, even if that is death, or we know someone who has, or we are thinking about a situation in the world where this is relevant, or we are thinking about some element of our future and what we want to be involved in. In essence, it's something we care about somehow. And that is what one of the huge values that authentic materials present. And in that context, they activate higher order thinking skills as well, which means that the activity in the class is more meaningful and more beneficial and more connected to the learner's mind, their experiences, and that content is going to be more secure with the learners once they've been introduced to it. We're giving a focus on learner voices. Why? Because it values students as people. Everyone has something they want to say. And in a second language, and we develop a skill at doing that in our first language, and in a second language, it's no different. That skill needs to be developed. And helping students to do that is really showing that we value them as people, not just as learners of this content which we're bringing to the classroom. And it also supports expression of views. So as I mentioned, we've authentic materials bring up personal views, for example, but a focus on learner voices supports helping learners to do that. So you can think about things such as, how do we say this in a considerate way without causing someone to feel angry or upset? All of those kinds of skills that we would help students with in our first language development are also things we can bring to second language development, and need to, because it's different in each language, and there are cultural or linguistic specifics which are important for us to help learners to identify and help them to mediate the expression of their views. Then we've got the impacts of critical incidents. Why are they important? And critical incidents can be good incidents or bad incidents, so they're helpful or unhelpful incidents in class where we learn something about our teaching or our learners or the content which we didn't realize before. And that critical in this sense means vital and reflective. So they're great as specific learning moments. So not every moment in a classroom is a critical incident, but if we take that reflection from it, then it becomes one. And it could be because something went wrong, or it could be because everything was great. And why was that? Reflecting on these critical incidents influences our future actions and gives us more confidence and more skill and more talent to deal with future situations, and gives us a stronger basis for future actions. And they definitely need unpacking. We can't look at a critical incident and say that happened because of this. Done. There's more layers to it than that. There's more to think about in terms of the different aspects of the context and the different actions that we took, or the students took, or the materials brought to the class, such as the taboos and issues content, which in my context, it ended up that resource was kept in the director's office, and we had to go and ask for it and explain how we would use it. And in that sense, the director was helping us to reflect on, in a critical way, on the approach we were taking to the resources in class. So a lot of criticality is beneficial in dealing with these kinds of issues. And then teacher emotions, probably something that you've not come across a lot, although there have been several books published in the last few years about this finally. It's certainly something that wasn't part of my initial teacher development, and not something that's been common until recently. So teacher emotions and teaching's emotional labor needs to be acknowledged. It's valuable for engaging with authentic materials, learner voices, and critical incidents, because how we feel and how the act of using these resources, or focusing on learner voices, or reflecting on critical incidents, how that will take something out of us emotionally. Our emotional labor is really important to what we're bringing to class, what we're bringing to the learning environment, and the process of learning as well. Because traditionally, teacher emotions have been seen as something problematic. If only we could get rid of them, then the teacher would be perfect. But that's not who we are, just as much as our students aren't emotionless kind of automatons, neither are we. And acknowledging and reflecting on teacher emotions will benefit our teaching as well. So those are some key premises. And now challenges to the value of these features. So the problems that people bring when we talk about these things, or the problems that people raise. So some common issues or beliefs around these things. with use of authentic materials, there's often an objection to them in that they contain bias or prejudice. The world out there is full of opinions, but many of those opinions are biased or reflect prejudice, and that can be problematic when our authentic materials contain that. Equally, they can be quite difficult to process for learners because they're written often for a culturally experienced first language audience, whether it's a trashy newspaper that uses lots of jargon and slang, or something very academic, which has got complex vocabulary and grammatical constructions in it. That challenge that it presents raises learner anxiety. And it could be inappropriate for classes. Authentic materials don't have the same considerations of audience that we bring to a classroom in that building that safe and appropriate environment. So there's lots of objections or roadblocks that people put up to use of authentic materials, as well as the time it takes teachers to create materials and resources around them to exploit them for learning. A problem with which is raised about a focus on learner voices is that it leads to conflict in class. Different students with different opinions can get into a bit of an argument about things, and that is a challenge for the safe space too. That raises concerns about complaints, that the teacher is worried that they might get into trouble for bringing that topic into class. And certainly if you go in with a page on death and a student, and students find this difficult, then your tutor, your director would say, well, why did you bring that topic into class? Why did that seem to be appropriate to you? And that can create a problem in that we think, well, I'm never doing anything like that again. And so there's a kind of what we might want to put in there instead is let's reflect on the approach that you took and how that could be dealt with in a different way. Because death is certainly something that students have to talk about in their real lives, and in the inability to talk about that could increase learners' feelings of isolation and loneliness. So that's really important that we tackle these issues in a way which is supportive to learners. And a focus on learner voices could also create a risk to relationships in terms of the teacher's relationship with the students, or students' relationships with each other or with the school, for example. So there's often, don't go there, stick to just role plays of the situational content that course books often cover, because that's nice and safe. But it doesn't help learners to get out of that transactional kind of use of a language. So then we've got issues with the impact of critical incidents. Often there's a focus only or primarily on negative classroom experiences. And the idea that we shouldn't have negative experiences in class, and we've somehow failed if we do that. And we want to work to avoid those bad experiences in future. So that can be one of the issues that comes up with the use of critical incidents in teacher development. And also not providing enough help to reflect on those critical incidents then. So that can be something that's in the way in which teacher training is organized, for example, in a school environment or a teaching environment, or if you're working alone, the lack of support to do that. So it's always good to reach out to teacher associations if you're in that situation. And then with teacher emotions, emotions I mentioned are traditionally seen as problematic, teacher emotions, and there can be a focus on good emotions versus bad emotions. So feeling upset would be a bad emotion for the classroom. But actually, it tells us so much if we go into it about what raised that upset and how we can navigate it. And also the idea of us being strong folks, the image of teachers as pushing the boulder up the hill, taking all of the weight of our students and the classes needs on our shoulders, and being kind of unaffected by physical or emotional pressures. And that image is something that I think hopefully we're challenging now. We're recognizing that we all bring a complex identity and experience to the class, and that's something to benefit from rather than avoid. So with these concerns and approaches, um, uh, uh, with these issues, there are concerns and there are opportunities, and I've got two of both here. So the first one is broaching challenging topics using authentic materials and handling diverse viewpoints can be daunting. We don't know what to do. How do I begin? Where do I start? How do I avoid the risks of this area that I want to bring in? And then from that, doing so presents risks for teachers. We're going to look at a psychological model in a moment, which talks about threats to and loss of things we value, such as our classroom relationships or our professional roles even. So those concerns, really, those are two of the main concerns which encapsulate the avoidance of these approaches, which include learner voices and authentic materials and critical incidents and teacher emotions. And you can see the idea of the teacher locked up emotionally, doing some very safe vocabulary and grammar work, for example, but it's not a rich environment for learning. Then we've got the opportunities. Adding this dimension to the familiar, anticipated and problems and solutions in our lesson planning encourages anticipatory reflection. So if I'm bringing the topic of death into a classroom, then what problems can I anticipate and what solutions can I put in place in advance of the lesson in my planning to try and navigate that and yet bring the topic in a way that students can feel engaged with and participate in. And we'll talk about those a little bit later, but authentic materials really can help with that because they take the focus away from the learners and put it on something other, which can then make all of that easier. Anticipating problems and and then the second point, anticipating emotional experiences and benefiting from difficult emotions experienced through unsuccessful teaching moments. So this is kind of part of the critical incident process. If we're thinking about and anticipating emotional experiences, how will I feel in the class? I always have, when I'm doing teacher training and we're looking at a particular training session, which is about learners who are in a country through some trauma experience, such as war or famine or abuse or something like that. There is a video that we play of some people, and it always leaves me a crying wreck, absolutely, without fail. It's such a caring and window onto some people's experiences, spoken by them themselves, that it's always going to affect me emotionally. But how then thinking about that and then benefiting from the difficult emotions experienced through that, for example, is really powerful, and it reveals something that you can show about the situation or that kind of experience, and that can add, for example, elements of consideration to the development of learner voices. And it could be also difficult emotions experienced through unsuccessful teaching moments, where something didn't go right and we feel somehow that we have failed, something like that. We might, if we feel that way, never do that again. We might say, that doesn't work for me. I tried using that, it didn't work, I'm not going to use that again. But if we are looking at those difficult emotions and seeing what led to those, we can find points that are actual positive professional development points for building from those unsuccessful teaching moments as well. So those are massive opportunities that come through focusing on this kind of these kinds of elements in teaching. So, how can we help ourselves and our learners? First, let's understand these emotions. So this is a lot, so don't worry, I'm going to talk you through it. Emmy van Deurzen's compass of emotions is something in psychology. If we look at the highlighted words here, there are basically 4 sections. There's a threat to value, which is something a threat to what we value, which we might fight for, we might argue, we might push. On the bottom right, there's a loss of value. We lose something that we value, and we might flight, we might run away in that moment. There's aspiration to value. To get what we value, and in that moment we might think, how do I do that? What do I do? And freeze. And that fight, flight, and freeze is quite common as 3 of the basic psychological responses that we have to experiences. And then there's achieving what we value, gaining or regaining what we value. And the key verb there is take, that we want that and we accept it and we take it. And in the boxes around these, there are some emotions. So when there's a threat to what we value, we might feel pride or jealousy or anger. And the problem then is that when those emotions come out, there's often contributes to any issues or problems that there are. If we lose what we value, for example, we lose a student, or we have a class taken away from us, or we lose our job, for example, then we would feel despair, fear, sorrow. And that's a bad place for us to be, you know, as teachers and as people. If we're in a low position of some sort and we're aspiring to value, and we see someone else maybe with it, or we recognize that we don't have it and other people do, we might feel emotions of desire, envy, and shame, and they might influence us and impact us negatively as well. And those are areas where we've got we're in a low state, areas of release, despondency, depression, or sadness. And these are, I'm sure you've experienced these as well, emotions that come to us in our teaching context as well as in our general life. And then we've got on this achieving of value, gaining or regaining what we value, you know, we feel joy, we feel love, we feel hope. And there's that sense that in this higher area, we've got exhilaration, happiness, we're on a high, but there might be some tension as well. And that tension might be in the threat to the things we value. So this model, when we apply it to teaching, I hope you can see that, you know, in any of these things that we've been talking about, there's the potential for these different emotions, thinking about these different contexts or experiences or moments that we might experience in bringing authentic materials to class, in focusing on learner voices, and in dealing with critical incidents. And being mature and responsible and reflective practitioners, knowing about these things helps us to then engage with them more critically and independently and objectively, and in a way in which we're then able to benefit from them and the richness that they give to us as teachers and people. So those are the emotions. Next, let's understand those critical incidents that we're in. So approaching critical incidents, which are powerful and personal insights, we can use them to scaffold our teacher development and to scaffold reflective classroom learning as well. How? Well, we need to recognize and value certain things. First of all, recognize and value positive experiences and helpful teacher emotions. Remember that joy or the hope and the getting things we value, taking those things we value in the classroom. And thoughts as we encounter these situations. Sorry, there's a missing letter there. And we also need to recognize and value negative experiences and not try and push them away and not try and forget about them, because they're equally important to our critical analysis of critical incidents. Also, unhelpful teacher emotions, whether it's pride or feeling challenged by the approach that someone else has taken, or whether it's the idea of despair or fear and running away from some resources that we might otherwise want to use because we don't want to think about losing our relationships with our students, for example, or something like that. And then also we've got thoughts as we reflect on these situations. So whether we get angry or whether we feel a bit of shame or envy or real happiness about something as well. All of those things are possibilities. And so recognizing and valuing these elements flying around our minds as we are dealing with critical incidents, dealing with these powerful personal experiences to get powerful personal insights from them is going to make us into better teachers who are better able to manage situations in class, whether they're things that we bring in as resources or things that appear in class through our learners as resources, what they bring into the classroom environment as well. So, which then further respects and values them as individuals as well. So, thinking about that, I'd like you to think for a minute and do a little bit of reflection and then share a couple of ideas in the chat, reflecting on emotions in critical incidents. So how and how much do you consider these four things in your teaching practice, in your life as a teacher? Do you consider students' opinions and their lived experience? And how do you consider that in your teaching and your planning and your supporting of learning? Number two, how much and how do you consider diversity within the classroom and beyond the classroom? There's a common kind of criticism of printed course materials that they show a very narrow range of life, and that life is much wider and much more diverse than the experience that we get in a course book. Number three, how and how much do you consider your own teacher emotions in your professional development? Are they something that you use as a tool to help you with your own professional development? And how do you use them as a tool? And four, how and how much do you consider constructing a safe environment in the classroom specifically for developing learner voices? We've already talked about one of our primary aims is to create a safe classroom environment, but we're talking about here for developing learner voices. So how much do you think about that and how do you think about it? So have a little think about these, maybe choose one or two, you don't have to look at all of them, and share some ideas with us in the chat about how much you do it. Maybe it's one, a lot, two, not at all, three, sometimes four, never until now, but I will, for example. And then how do you do these things? So take a minute and share your ideas. Remember, we're all at different stages in our development, and being able to just share where we are is actually being really brave and valuing our emotions as we do that as well. So um, uh, I'll give you a little minute to do that, and then I'll let you know mine. I'll type mine in the chat as well. Hi, Nazila. Just to say, thinking about these four areas of emotions and critical incidents, you know, how much do you think about these things as you are doing your teaching, planning your teaching, thinking about your experience in teaching? And if you do it, like you might do number one quite a lot, how do you do it? In what ways do you your thoughts about students' opinions and experiences affect your teaching? I hope that answers the query that you have. So my answer for number one, just to give you an example, is I always try to. I'm thinking about who my learners are and what they are going through as people, as much as I know about that from what they show me in the classroom. Thanks very much for those ideas. It's really nice to see those. Just to cover a couple of them here. Um, Nazila says, I try to be careful how to give my feedback. And that kind of relates to the safe environment for developing learner voices. If it's about what the learners are saying, about opinions and topics, and for example, if they're say something which someone could be upset by, then giving some careful feedback on that, for example. So keeping it focused on the idea of how learners can develop their voices about their opinions and what they want to say. Layla says, I let my students reflect on their personal experiences almost every lesson, since it is more real life approach for them to use the language. Absolutely. As mentioned here, ChatGPT is also helpful in these cases. And the comment about ChatGPT seems to have disappeared, which is sad because it was a good one. Then Layla says, not number two, not quite often. And yeah, that's one of the things that resources really challenge us on sometimes. So just opening that out can be a possibility. Elmira said, first of all, we create a safe classroom environment which makes students feel confident. So the safe classroom environment, yeah, absolutely in general, but then for developing learners' voices. So when you're bringing in these topics which students want to talk about and have things to talk about, how do you scaffold that? How, you know, because that's much harder, and that's why lots of teachers don't do it at all, because it's a challenge to that safe environment. Then number three, Layla says, I consider teacher emotions in my personal development to better understand the students better and be able to fill in the gaps in their learning process. Yeah, so where we're seeing what we're thinking about and then seeing how that gives us another route to go into how the students are feeling and being, and that helps to fill the gaps. I'm just going to share my ideas in the chat, which I've also put on another slide here. But I did make this as we're talking. So number one, I always try to, with students' opinions and lived experience, thinking about who my learners are and what they're going through. And how that could be impacted by the resources that I bring in, whether it's they're going through this problem, so I don't want to do anything too close to it, or they're going through this problem, so actually I do want to show a support for them by dealing with the general area. And number two, about diversity, I try and invite learners to give different ideas on situations and contexts to explore a variety of perspectives and realities within whatever the area is that we're talking about. For example, if you're talking about death, you can bring that in so many different ways, which are about a cultural event, such as a monarch dying and the way in which that is dealt with. It's so far distant from the student's own experience of death that it gives a space where that kind of vocal development, that inner voice development can be practiced, be shared, a safe space where it's not about me and my experience, but I can talk about my experience by talking about this other context. In terms of my own emotions, number three, teacher emotions, I self-reflect and I self-assess. And just about me, I can get anxious sometimes. So for me, that's a key thing in my mind to see how it influences my teaching and results, and the results of my teaching as well. So I'm like, oh, I'm feeling a bit nervous about this in this situation. How is that changing what choices I'm making as a teacher? And how is that then affecting my students in the way that they're accessing learning in my class? And then number four, thinking about the making the learning a safe learning environment for developing learners voices. I've already kind of mentioned that, finding resources that take important topics away from the students' own personal lives and put them into other contexts which they can speak about without sharing their own story. So these are the bits really. So how do we develop learners' voices safely but effectively? Some key considerations: presenting language and global issues in supportive content. Using these supportive contexts to create opportunities for learners' voices to come through by the questions that we ask, or the space that it creates. You can see it's a lot of things, there's a lot of things to think about and juggle in all of this, but I hope you're feeling excited by it as well. Inclusive, intersectional, news-based resources can offer that kind of safe environment because we're all used to the idea of news as a context, and it's always person focused, but it's not about us. So that gives us some of that space and some of that safety, and some of that distance, so I don't have to get too involved in my own personal life as I deal with this topic. And so that can feel quite reassuring. And finding content which values students' lives, their classroom environment, and wider diversity. So topics which are dealing with these content which is dealing with these topics inclusively, without political judgments, and without kind of right wing or left wing views or anything like that. That really deals with facts is a really key thing, and that's kind of where I can give an example from Sensations English, because that's what we do every day with all of our reports. We're always thinking about how to represent people, anyone in a report, fairly and respectfully. And one example would be this report here, which is about, it is Pride Month now, and the island of Cyprus, which has two governments on two different sides, in case you don't know, in two different halves of the island, and where the LGBT community there was united and came together in the what they call the green zone, the area which is not controlled by either of the parts of the island. And they had a celebration there, and it's a nice report which talks about differences and similarities and the way in which, and it gives us space for dealing with these issues from a distance, but also allowing our voices to come out. There's a QR code there, and it's available on the slides if you want to view that report. But that's just one example of many, and it's go from that example down to the pedagogy, the language skills development, and how that crosses over with the learning content. When it's topical and meaningful, you get really good language skills development. And why is it really good? Because you get enhanced uptake and output. So learners are taking in the content because it's more relevant and more meaningful to them, and so it's more easily moves from input to uptake, so it's absorbed by the students. To the extent that then output is taken directly from the input, as the students recycle the language to make their own points, to share their own views. And we've done classroom research on this with some of our resources, with teachers taking it and trialing it, and they're totally independent from us. We've just given them the tools. And one of the greatest responses from this, and with just students who are 12 years old, was that the students were engaged with the material and managed to use the language well in follow-up activities. The idea that rather than weeks and weeks of practice on some vocabulary, that the students were really interested in a report, and one of the reports that they used was about beatboxing, and a guy who had become a Buddhist monk who was then using beatboxing as a way of sharing Buddhist ideas. So you bring in topics of religion and music and street culture all together in a way which is about this guy who's sharing his passions. And the students then have a lot of vocabulary in the reports, which they can then use as they give as as they give their own opinions and share their own ideas in follow-up activities, which are then much more using higher order thinking. You know, there's much more going on, and it's a memorable learning experience for the students, which helps them to talk about their own ideas then. So connecting with learners, how do we do that? You know, not everything will a learner will care about, and certainly with a group with 12 years old, politics is nothing interesting to most 12-year-old students. So thinking about learners' concerns and learners' lived experience, the things that they like or are interested in or are worried about, and the things that they know because they're part of their lives. And that's where connecting with learners really happens. And accessible news-based content, whether it's sensations, English, or anything else, has a person-centered focus. So that's part one. So it's dealing with people. So that's connecting to, in some way, to lived experience. It gives examples of universals, things that one person is going through. We can translate them into our own experience or the experience of someone we know, or something that we've seen on a soap opera, or whatever it is. But it's something that we can connect with, and we can see the universal through that example and bring it back to our own context. It also connects with our life experience in exactly that way. And we find the equivalence in our worldview, which then encourages the development of schema, because we've got those ideas and the knowledge we have about those topic areas or situations primed and brought to the front of our mind, and then the content that the resources bring to us is easily included and added to our knowledge about those topics or areas. So it's really meaningful. In developing those learners' voices, then we've just got a tiny minute to go. So we're not going to have a chance to watch a video and do some practice, unfortunately. But in developing those learners' voices, we need learning based on real-world concerns and lived experience, authentic materials which approach topics sensitively and reflect helpful emotions and values. So that inclusive and positive presentation of situations. Harnessing of teacher emotions and their insights that we've talked about throughout this, and I'm sure you've got a little bit emotional at certain points during this session. I know I have. That's the key, really, because that brings the dimension that then helps us to create that safe environment for us and for our learners in these areas, and reflection on critical incidents. And the top task that we would have had if we had time was watch the following report, which is about disabled people with disabilities who are gamers using a new gaming controller, and decide how you could apply these ideas in your class and share the ideas in the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for that. So if you're on the Sensations English website, you'll be able to see this report. I'll just show you a few seconds of it. You're getting to see real people in a real life context who are using a real life piece of equipment
Sony's
for
got a
something that
new
we know a
controller for
lot. You know,
computer
almost all
games.
of us have played
It's for
games, lots of us play
PlayStation.
them regularly,
People with
whether it's
disabilities
PlayStation
can use it.
or
They had to
Xbox or
wait
whatever it
a
is.
long
So then imagine what you could do with that kind of resource. And finally, then in some summary, safe opportunities, providing safe opportunities for developing learners' voices requires reflective learning, person-centered contexts, inclusive language, mindful teachers, which is where the critical incidents and the teacher emotions really come in, global issues where we can access those in universals, and our teacher emotions. And just as a final summary, use authentic materials as safe contexts, focus on learner voices, reflect on learning moments as critical incidents, value your teacher emotions and emotional labor, understand and develop thoughtful responses to unhelpful emotions when they're in the context, and reflect on and value emotions in critical incidents. That's everything I've got to say. Sorry it's taken so long. I hope we'd have a bit more time. But I think the work you did thinking about those different elements of bringing these topics into class was really helpful. There's some references which you'll get on the slides as well. And just to say, check out the other Sensations English webinars for teachers so you get more ideas on dealing with authentic materials or video and digital resources. If you're interested in using Sensations English, talk to your school about getting the school's edition, and there's information about that on the website. And enjoy using these graded, authentic global resources for ELT. Follow us on our socials and check out the latest resources. Any questions? Let's have a look and see if there are any questions. There are no questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box. Feel free to type any now. I'm happy to stay around for another few minutes and answer any questions that you've got. But thank you for being here today. Nazila, thanks for your contributions, as well as Elmira and Layla. They were excellent, excellent things to get for me to hear. Thank you very much. Layla, thanks very much. Thank you all for your lovely comments as well. Did nobody have any questions? Okay, well, feel free to get in touch and on socials, for example, you can just answer any questions. LinkedIn is a great place to follow me, and you can find me via Sensations English on LinkedIn. Great, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, then just say look out for our next webinar coming at the end of July, and information about that will be shared very soon. Thank you very much for being here today. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, morning, night, wherever you are in the world, and enjoy bringing some of these ideas into your classroom and into your teaching. Thanks, and take care, everybody.